Okay, we're going to try this on Zoom in the hopes that this works. I'm going to record this to Zoom and then upload it to YouTube and then probably post it on the Virtual Academy of the Rapier. So my name is Matteo, Master Matteo, and I am doing this video to respond to a video recently posted by Master John Drake that elicited a certain amount of discussion. This video is probably going to be long. It will be less interesting than John's video because it will be less visual. I don't have good film editing stuff, so I like to incorporate other videos that I don't actually have access to on a hard drive. I can't do that. So if I wind up doing some video analysis, I'm going to have to do like a shared screen thing and go to YouTube and see how that works out. So hopefully you'll stick with me during this, and we'll come to a conclusion about the question that John raised. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen if I can remember how to do that. I'm going to pause recording while there we go. And now that I've revealed that to you, here we are. So time of the hand, wherein it is shown that without malice and with good charity, that Master John Drake is a heretic by me. So this comes from the Onstuarn Oath, to love truth and to hate falsehood. That's one of the things that the mods in Onstuar swear, but no, I'm not calling him an oath breaker, so, stop it. So first of all, I'm really grateful. I'm grateful that John posed his question. He's not a heretic. I am just trying to inject a little humor into the sort of debate that back in period might have led to some bloodshed in the streets of London. It's really important that when we do scholarship in the SCA that we realize that it requires that we have to reevaluate some of the things that we might believe to be true. This is true in any form of scholarship, but in the SCA, it is also true, especially as we talk about fencing, and we talk about what is good fencing, what is not good fencing, or what is ideal fencing, what works, what doesn't work. We really have to be willing to self-analyze our own preconceived biases, the things we believe to be true. That's what John did. And he's been doing it for a long time, and that's good. Challenging sort of like ancient wisdom, or whatever you want to call it, and challenging it directly on the field. However, his position has to hold up to scrutiny too. And that includes not only philosophical scrutiny, but also scientific and tactical scrutiny. Although I'm really only going to engage in one of those forms of scrutiny over the course of this evaluation. I happen to be really grateful that he made his video, that he took the time to do his research, and he was bold enough to come forward and say, this is what I believe. I found that to be bold. I just disagree with him. And I find myself called upon to support my disagreement with sort of academic rigor to the best of my ability within a couple of days of doing some cursory research into the subject. So first of all, let's talk about truth and falsehood. This is what happened in the video. Master John Drake is one of the top fencers in the SCA. As far as I'm concerned, he's the top fencer in the SCA right now. I think he's the best. He would disagree with me. He has ideas about who's better than him. I think he's wrong. I think he's actually the best fencer we have. But anyway, he created this video and he called into question the use and application of time of the hand. He referred in that video to time of the hand as, quote, to extend your sword arm all the way out first before you move your foot. That is how he referred to it, in as much as he was referring to how we sort of explain it or teach it, etc. And I think it's important to specifically say that. I don't think that's an accurate reading of time of the hand or what time of the hand means, but I do think that's how it typically gets taught. And I know that I, in the past, have likely done so. That I have not been precise enough in terms of body mechanics when teaching time of the hand. So it's pretty common to happen. He further asserted, and I think he was right about this, that this isn't something that people typically do in combat. He's right. People don't typically do that in combat. And I don't disagree with that. And then he thinks that it's not the best. I think that's incorrect. But anyway, asterisk. As support for his argument, he used video clips of various top-level fencers, which we will look at later. We're going to look at, I think we're going to look at it later. We'll see if I have time before bedtime for the kid. But I want to look at that video and analyze that video directly and show some things that I'm seeing in that video that, that weren't necessarily discussed in his video, but I think are important to also look at as context. And at the end of the clip, Master John makes a very bold claim. He says the most efficient lunge is to move your hand and foot at the same time. This is a big claim because it runs counter to everything that we've known about fencing all along. He's saying that if you move your foot, and I assume he means the front foot, lifting your foot at the same time that you move your hand, that is the most efficient lunge. I'll put that at the top of this because that is the thing that I want to talk about in this video. Many of his assertions and thoughts in the video aren't really empirical statements, and that's okay. That's not a judgment from me. He talks about like how deep they are in tournaments and what quality of fencers they are and what they do, et cetera, et cetera. That isn't really what I'm interested in talking about right now, because he made a very clear empirical statement and he associated it with training purposes. So the question I'm grappling with is the above statement. And I think that's something that we can interrogate on an objective level. So he said the most efficient lunge is to move your hand and foot at the same time. The most efficient, move them at the same time. I think that he and I would agree that the most efficient lunge would deliver the point to the target in the least amount of time. So if I'm lunging with peak efficiency, I'm delivering my point to the target in the least amount of time, because the victory condition of our game is we hit our opponent with a valid blow before they hit us in a reasonable time before they hit us. Other concerns, I think, that relate or are interwoven into this conversation are tactical in nature, and that's not something I'm really interested in grappling with. Emphatically, I'm not claiming something like the most efficient lunge would deliver the point successfully to the target in the least amount of time while also providing for my own body's safety. While I think that's a worthwhile conversation to have as fencers, that's not really what I'm talking about right now. I really want to talk about efficiency in terms of delivering the point to the target in the least amount of time. I'm also not trying to comment on John's fencing. This lecture is no way intended to speak ill of him or his fencing. It speaks for itself. He is one of the most successful, if not the most successful combatant in the SCA currently fighting at this time. He's incredible. It speaks for himself. In no way, I in no way intend to put myself above him as a fencer. I have my own qualifications, and I'm certain in those qualifications. I don't doubt my own knowledge or ability. I have a lot of experience and understanding and scholarship of myself. I'm proud of that, but I'm not trying to put myself above John. And finally, my sole intention is to interrogate the aforementioned conclusion he draws from his research. So, historical research. First of all, most period masters in the Western martial arts tradition disagree on lots of stuff, but nearly all of them agree on the principle of the time of the hand. This is true for both cutting and thrusting art. And this is true throughout a wide scope of history. So it's not just with the rapier, it's also with like longsword and some other treatises. They almost universally agree that the hand should precede the foot when attacking with either a cut or a thrust. But maybe they were wrong. Like maybe for hundreds of years, we've been holding ourselves back under the tyranny of this notion that the hand must lead. Maybe lots of people died because they were taught something that was not objectively true. We could do our own research if we wanted to. We could come up with our own amateur or quasi-amateur scientific data, but that's tricky for us because first of all, we're under the thumb of this plague. And second of all, we don't necessarily, very few of us are kinesiology professors. Very few of us have access to the kind of equipment and whatnot necessary to do real testing, very specific, minute testing of musculature and what acts first and whatnot, with the possible exception of Martin. So happily mundane scientists have done related research to this very question, and they can perhaps provide us with some objective answers to the question. So this is about the biomechanics of a lunge. Okay. So biomechanics of, this is a paper that I found, which was a broad scope paper that collected the data from many other peer-reviewed papers and collected into one place. It was called Biomechanics of Fencing Sport, a Scoping Review. I have this linked in this lecture. If you want to follow the link and go look at the thing, you can, or you can just Google it under these words if you'd like and take a look at the thing. It has a very useful list of citations in it, and you can follow all those papers in the citations, and you can get into the deep weeds, which I did all day today, of what each of these individual things found. And it's interesting, and it's conflicting, and it's fascinating, and I recommend that you do it because it's a really interesting ride through like biomechanics for modern fencing. So the abstract from the study was basically just stated that the aim of our scoping review was to identify and summarize current evidence on the biomechanics of fencing to inform athlete development and injury prevention. Really what they're trying to look for, which I think we're all trying to look for, which I think John was in many ways commenting on, was trying to find ideal ways to develop fencers and develop their lunge, to develop their attack. And I hope, and I think, and I assume that he also was interested in injury prevention. I mean, that's, all of us are interested in that as well. So the research draws upon many other studies, as I said before, which are in turn available to click, which I said before. You're going to find things in those other studies that seem to refute my central argument. One of the reasons I use this meta-analysis is that it takes the body of the work on the whole regarding the subject, and then it processes it all in order to come to its conclusions. So there are a couple disclaimers that I do need to make. The data was rated as fair, mostly due to small sample sizes across the studies that they looked at. It's hard to test large groups of expert fencers. It's hard to find large groups of expert fencers. And the analysis of their methods is included in the study. So as a part of that study, you can look at the analysis of their methods and how they came to that conclusion. I will say that in most of these studies, what they did was they were able to find like 10 to 15 fencers, and they were looking for fencers of varying abilities. So fencers that would be like considered to be experts or elite fencers in their particular field, and fencers who were novices or people who were not elite. That's how they sort of defined that in most of those studies. The studies also, by the way, included both men and women. Some of the studies focused specifically, say, on like a group of a dozen women. Some of them focused on like the men's Air Force fencing team, so that was all men, like 15 people. So we do get some interesting data in this overall paper, by the way, if you're interested, on like differences in reaction time and differences in explosive strength, et cetera, between those biological sexes. These studies looked at modern fencers. Here's the other disclaimer, and this one's really important, and I think it could be something that undermines the argument that I'm making, but I don't think it is. These studies looked at modern fencers using mundane weapons. So epee and foil is what I focused on, although they do talk about saber some, but saber's less relevant to standard rapier point thrust fencing, so I wasn't as concerned with that, with the studies that I also looked into and linked off of. So it's possible that the rapier would change that as a factor in terms of answering this fundamental question. Is it so different that we can't use this data to analyze the biomechanics of what we do? Maybe, but I have to imagine that there's a correlation of some kind between the fact that most of the period masters said lead with your hand, even with a rapier, or lead with the arm, rather, however you want to put that, and that still continues to be true regardless of the fact that the weapon has changed so radically over the centuries since the period that we recreate. So I pulled two rather important paragraphs, and I've included them in their entirety here. So I don't want to make it look like I'm cutting things out that don't fit with my argument. But this is the one that I read, and they were talking about coordination, like some of the things that they found about coordination of both joint and muscle. So in this thing, proximal to distal means from the center to the outside. Okay, so proximal to distal, I'm just going to read it, which is going to be boring, but I want to be clear about it. The proximal to distal coupling of upper and lower limb motion ensures an effective transfer of joint segmental angular velocity of the lower limb to the maximum linear velocity of the center of mass, a feature which differentiates elite from novice fencers. Elite fencers extend the weapon arm prior to initiating front foot movement during the lunge. You could argue that that's their training, like it's just tradition, therefore they do it that way. However, as we continue on, focusing specifically on the coordination among lower limb joints. So now we're shifting just to the lower limb. So forget about the arms for a little bit. So much and so forth, identified that elite fencers exhibited greater peak horizontal sword velocity and lunge distance in compared to novice fencers through a clearly sequential increase in angular velocity of joint extension from the hip to the knee to the ankle. So from towards the torso down to the floor. This kinematic sequence was claimed to be the correct technique that increases fencing success in elite fencers. Du Yao, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, and I apologize, has identified a refractory period existing between motor tasks that had negative effects on fencing performance. That little sentence there isn't highlighted, but it's really important. We're going to talk about it later. But like what that basically means is that the gap between each individual component of the lunge can be a problem for the efficiency of the lunge, and narrowing that gap is really important. And then it goes on. Elite fencers were competent to inhibit the effects by closely linking touche, meaning the extension, movement of the arm, and lunge movements of the legs in perfect timeline. Technical training should take into account of specific fencing movement patterns with emphasis on practicing different movement components in combination rather than in separate form. And so with this overall study's finding is that the combination of movements is what needs to be worked on. And if people are teaching or inhabiting each individual movement, first do this, do this, do this, then do this, and separating them, they're not training that linked chain of movement that creates the most efficient lunge. Muscle coordination was the next section in that paper, and you can go to the link, or if you can link on it. If you can't click on it, then I'll try to post the PowerPoint, I guess, up on Virtual Academy. That might work. So muscle coordination, right out of the gates. The proximal to distance sequence was also reported for muscle activation, with activation of the anterior deltoid of the armed upper limb, with extension of the armed hand preceding the lifting of the lead foot at the initiation of lunging in expert fencers. In contrast, novice fencers exhibited a delayed onset of upper limb muscle activity associated with shortened propulsion phase by the trailing leg, resulting in an earlier kicking off of the trailing leg in novice fencers. So overall, the elite fencers who led with the hand, or led with the arm, rather, engaging the deltoid, rather with the arm, and followed with the foot, they presented more coherent muscle synergies of the upper and lower limbs compared to novice fencers, characterized by sequential activation of shoulder elbow extensors of the upper arm limb and hip knee extensors of the rear lower limb, followed by activation of the forelimb, which is to say the lower leg, during lunging, with the ability to maintain this quasi-invariant pattern of activation despite changing task requirements during a fencing bout, which means that the more consistent they were with leading with the arm and then following with the foot, the more successful they were and the more they were able to meet changing task requirements during a fencing bout. And that one comes from a paper, I believe, wherein they started talking about like what does it take to change targets in mid-movement, and how does that reflect on like changing conditions in an active fencing bout where people are moving dynamically. In contrast, muscle activation patterns for novice fencers were more variable, with changing task demands imposed by their opponents, often leading to interruptions in their movement. While elite fencers are able to finely adjust muscle activation patterns to optimize lunge efficiency without violating correct kinematic sequence of upper and lower limb motions, as mentioned above. So the more elite the fencer, the more likely they would be to be able to consistently act in a way that led with the arm and followed with really a launching of the back leg and then a lifting of the front foot. So what does that translate to? The elite fencers achieved the highest degree of sword velocity with the most consistency. I'm going to put a little asterisk there because there's one example where that's one interesting example where they didn't find that to be they kind of didn't find that to be the case. But anyway, these fencers activated their arm before lifting their foot. The proximal to distal sequence was also reported for muscle activation, with activation of the anterior deltoid of the upper limb with extension of the armed hand preceding the lifting of the lead foot. I'm just re-putting that here to re-emphasize the point that was made in the previous slide. So who's right? If we say that the most efficient lunge was a coordinated lunge between the arm, a flex of the rear hip, then the flex of the lead knee, sorry, the rear hip all the way down to the ankle, and then a flex of the lead knee, followed by the lifting of the forward foot, it appears that John's statement about the most efficient lunge is incorrect, assuming we decide to accept that these findings sufficiently apply to rapier. If we don't accept that, then you can dismiss the whole slideshow and call me an old fart and move on. But if we accept that these findings in these studies apply to our art, and I think they do, then I think we have to conclude that John's statement that the most efficient lunge is hand plus foot at the same time is simply untrue. However, I do think he makes some really great points about some other issues, especially the way in which the coordination of these individual movements are taught and how the individual coordination of these movements manifest when you're fencing. And especially when we're fencing live, in person, competing at whatever level we happen to be competing at the moment. So one of the studies that I thought was interesting in this larger study did find that the elite fencers they were looking at were moving their feet before their hands, but their lunges clocked slower than the novices' lunges in terms of total time to target, and the novices were leading with their hand. So there must have been a reason that they were doing it. It's not the most efficient method of delivering point to target, at least not according to the studies, but they were doing it for a reason, and these are elite fencers. So what were they gaining? I think they might be trying to gain something tactically, and maybe at that level of play, there's something to be gained tactically from this system, which would then correlate to what John is referring to. But that still doesn't make his statement true. Another study, which is linked here. I didn't link the last one. I'm sorry. I got up to do lunch and then came back and whatever. Anyway, it was gone. Measured the work of female fencers who'd been fencing for 5 to 9 years. There's about a group of, I think, a dozen of them. This study showed that fencers who extended their hand first, or the hand first, delivered their point to the target before the fencers who initiated their lower extremities. And this study was trying to talk about, like, okay, so if you're coaching, which of these systems of delivering lunge, foot or hand first, would be a mistake or something that required correction, and which one would be correct? And so they found that through measurement, that the ones who extended their hands first arrived at target first, and so the ones who didn't were the ones who needed to be corrected. So John and Miles have Miles posted a big thing as well, his own take on John's video. They have a really good point about the importance of the lower body. So in terms of generating velocity, oh, by the way, and so does Bettina, John's mom, who posted as well, was debating as well, who is mundanely a doctor. In terms of generating velocity, the lower extremities are essential, and using them in correct sequences of utmost importance. That's what I'm finding in this research. It correlates with what these guys are saying. We should learn and we should teach this. However, the sequences refer to modern fencing stances, and that might not correlate as well to people who do period work or stances not found in these studies. So that's something to think about. If you're somebody who does period martial arts, it may not exactly correlate. One of the studies in particular said that the most power on a lunge was generated from a perpendicular, that's not working for my thing, a perpendicular stance, so an L-shaped stance with my feet. And not everybody does that. And in period, that really wasn't always the case. But they did find that generated the most power, but that's also like not a back-weighted stance, so it's a little bit more complicated than that. If we teach a lunge that does not involve a strong push off the trailing leg, tightly following the engagement of the arm, we are definitely doing a disservice to our fencers. I think that is something that we need to think about, something I need to think about as an instructor. The goal would be to link the engagement of the arm and the rear hip and knee into an integrated, seamless movement. The elite fencers lead with the arm, but they also had lower gap time between each segment of the movement, and that's really important. And this actually winds up sounding, I think, closest to Miles's take. Master Miles has asserted that with the activation of the arm followed incredibly closely, he says it by the body, but I think he's referring to, what he might be referring to is his rear hip. I think that gives the most motivation to the torso. And so, and he can correct me if he disagrees, but I think you might want to think about that. And so I think it's the closest to his take on it. All right, but what about geometry? So this is another key point that I want to make about the lunge as described by John and as shown in this video. So I think it's clear now, at least, that if we accept that this research applies to our game, that the fastest movements were achieved by coordinating rear hip and arm extension. Okay. And so, but what if your point is refused? Like, what if your point's not in presence? So the studies of oh wow, I didn't write that well on the slide. Sorry about that. So the studies overall covered this, but and when they had illustrations of how the weapons were being held by their subjects, they either had photographs or illustrations in some cases. Most of those weapons were held in presence before the lunge. So that matters because that means the point is at X place before it moves on. And looking at John's video, it does look like most of the fencers he's showcasing that move hand and foot together do not extend the weapon into place until just before or after their front foot hits the ground. John's lunge is very similar to like a modern saber lunge, wherein you're lunging for a cut. If you watch a modern saber lunge, it typically moves forward and then can come up under the cut. This is a speculation, so take it with a grain of salt, but I think his thrust and his conclusions about the time of the hand stem from an adaptation to his stance. He typically carries his sword point primarily out of presence, and so it's motivated to gain as much ground forward as possible while protecting himself with his dagger in order to actually get to somebody and land a blow. John's not a tall guy, he's like 5'6". It would be inefficient for him to extend from that position fully before he moved his body. That would take a lot of time, right? Because he's refused. It takes like this much time to even get the sword in presence. So he still has to move his point, but like his point is in X spot and he has to get to Y place, and he still has to get through that distance. And that's going to take time, okay? Which is not to say that it's an inferior tactical choice. I don't want to make that point at all. I'm not talking about tactics. I'm not talking about what works, what doesn't work. I'm saying that he has more distance to cover than he would have to cover if his sword was in presence at the beginning of his lunge, okay? I've noticed that many of the top level fighters operate from a refused stance. And so it stands to reason that they typically operate under similar body mechanics. I believe that there is an association between the body mechanics that he's promoting and the sort of gunslinger stance for a fencer. However, geometry is a thing that nobody gets to ignore. It's there, it's real. The rules of geometry govern a lot of this, a lot of what we're talking about, and we need to pay attention to it. So velocity does affect time to target, but geometry does as well. The closer an object is to its target, the less time it takes to get there. It's just the fastest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Everybody, I think, would agree. If I'm 6 inches from a target, it takes me less time to get from that point to the target than if I'm 12 inches from the target, 18, 36, whatever. Increased velocity only makes that more effective. So if I'm at 6 inches and I move at Y speed and I increase my speed from Y to X, I'm only faster at 6 inches than I would be at 12. The extended arm puts the point closer to the opponent than the refused arm. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. If you operate with your sword in presence, it begins its life or its journey on a lunge closer to the opponent than it would if it's not in presence. It has to travel less distance to get to the target. It takes less time. The extended arm and body-aligned linear thrust, or lunge, minimizes non-linear movement of the point during the process of the lunge. Okay. In other words, it causes the point to travel along a line closer to a true straight path. So if I'm lunging and my lunge carries my point in an arc because I'm lifting my body off the ground and I'm going in an arc, like over a small hill, if you will, my point isn't traveling straight. It's traveling in an arc. Okay. If my point travels in an arc, it is traveling a longer distance than it would, assuming the distance is the same, from point A to point B. If from point A to point B, my sword travels in an arc, it's going to travel a longer total distance. You could take that arc and stretch it out than if it travels in a straight line. Okay, if you stretched out the arc line, it would be longer than the straight line. I think and that's true like anytime you disengage, right? It's like your point travels in a spiral when you disengage. And so if you disengage, that takes longer to get to the opponent than it does if you just go in a straight line. Any curvature to the straight line is inarguably less efficient than the straight line itself. And in every lunge, there's curvature. Like nobody's got that perfect straight, no BS, 100% straight line. Nobody has it. But the less curvature you can put in the line, the faster your point will get to the opponent. And that's just inarguably true. So let's look at tempo. So a single discrete action, a tempo, taken either in measure or on the way into measure, the fewer tempi an action takes, the more efficient it is. So if I can do something in 1 time, it's more efficient than if I do it in 2. Even if 2 is a superior choice tactically at that moment, at a given moment. A lunge is typically considered to be 1.5 times, depends on who you talk to, but about 1.5 times. It's a long tempo, and it involves a lot of individual body movements. If a fencer's foot touches down, and then the attack is thrown, we're not talking about a single motion any longer. We're talking about 2 tempi, maybe even 2.5. It kind of depends on the fencer when all that happens. But if we do this like quasi lunge, where we like lunge into the lunge position and then throw an attack, what we're doing is taking 1 tempo to get in position and then leading an attack with our hand, which is very efficient if you survive that first tempo. If a fencer's point lands before the foot touches or when the lead foot touches, ideally when the lead foot touches, little to no velocity has been wasted. we don't lose much time. But if it lands after the foot touches, when it could have landed before or at the moment the foot landed, if you had first extended, then we have lagged the arrival of the point behind the arrival of the foot. Let me try to explain that again. If my foot hits and then my point hits, when my point could have hit first, if I'd extended first, I have cost myself time. I have definitely slowed my lunge and lunged more inefficiently. All right, so John's video. Fencers showcased in John's video typically do not land their blow with the time of their foot, except in the instance of Tortaka. He typically does. Their shot lands after their foot, just after, like just after. And it's thus less efficient, even by a little bit, than it otherwise would be. I think this is a function of the refused blade gunslinger stance that most of them are taking. I think it takes so long to get the point across that space that even though they have maximized their velocity forward, their point is lagging just behind their foot. I don't know that I can pick that up. I don't know if you can, but it is inarguably less efficient than it would be if the point landed sooner, which it would do if it extended first. Interestingly, a very close analysis of the coordination of Tora's most successful attacks across John's video show that his hand, which is really represented through the way that his sword point moves, happens just before his foot moves, just before. It's actually incredibly efficient. When viewing John's single-time thrust against Tora and their final bout at Penzig in 2017, Tora lifts his foot with his hand in the final exchange. They go up together, and he gets killed in tempo by John. I think that's really important because in the video that we see, he beats John when his hand moves first. In the video of John beating him in, I think it's 2017, it's at the All-Star tournament, his hand and his foot come up at exactly the same time, and John immediately reads it, closes offline, picks it up with his dagger, and kills him. Even that tiny little change in efficiency, at the very least, helped John hit him in tempo. Finally, each of the fighters operate with their blade largely out of presence. I said that earlier. This lengthens the distance between their point and the target. Whether that matters to them doesn't matter. If they're fast enough to hit you with their blade out of presence, then they don't have to worry about you controlling their blade if they put it into presence. So there's a tactical advantage to that for people who are quick enough physically, whose neuromuscular pathways are fast enough to do that. But if they didn't, they would still arrive sooner. So they are sacrificing lunge efficiency for the ability to avoid having their blade controlled by their opponent. So I think the time of the hand survives. I think he's incorrect about what constitutes the most efficient lunge, assuming that by efficient we mean a lunge that causes the point to arrive at its target before it otherwise would have, using a different sequence of movements. I think the science agrees with me. However, I think there's a definite problem in the way in which the time of the hand is taught. And I am guilty of this as well. That's not true across the boards. I think if you look at a lot of people who are working with like the sword school or the swordplay school out in California with Puck and people who get certified through there, I think they know this. I think they are certain of it. Brad Kramer, who's in that current program right now, posted probably the most clear video of this principle in action to that thread. And I would recommend that you go see it. I may show it in a second here and then attach that to this overall video. A sequent engagement of the lower extremities should be prioritized in training. We should connect it directly with the extension of the hand, but we should definitely teach engaging the arm before the lead foot is lifted in the lunge. So in the next video I do, or maybe if I attach it to this one, I'm not sure which, I'm going to include a discussion of the tactical advantages. You know what? It won't be on this one. I'll do a different one that's tactical. And I might do that as a discussion, the tactical advantages of using the concept of time of the hand. And it should be less boring than a PowerPoint. So thanks for listening. Let me stop share. Thanks for listening. I will try to get those files up on the Virtual Academy page, and you can take a look. You can follow them. You can look on that. If you want to disagree with me, we can debate about the various different studies. I'm going to ask you to be thorough with your investigation, to be complete, to take a look at it, and we'll see. I'm happy to be wrong. I just don't think I am, and I think the science supports what I'm doing, and I think the history and tradition of fencing across the Western world, at the very least, supports that. I appreciate what John did. I'm grateful that he did it. And I hope that you will interrogate this on your own.